Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson School. My name is Hugh Price. I'm a visiting professor and lecturer here. Before the introduction, I'll just do two administrative things. One, as they say in the movies, please be sure to turn off all cell phone devices. Apparently there's some disruption if they're on. And secondly, just a reminder, there will be a reception after today's event downstairs where we just were. I'd like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson School lecture series on the role of social movements in shaping public policy. And it's an absolute delight for me to introduce today's speaker, the Honorable Julian Bond. Mr. Bond and I are of roughly the same era in college. He was an undergraduate at Morehouse in Atlanta in the late 50s, early 1960s, and he was already famous among students like me who were in northern colleges. It's also a great treat to introduce Mr. Bond because he's led such an utterly fascinating and consequential life. And it'll be fun recounting some of those highlights for you very briefly. Mr. Bond has evolved over the course of his life from a shaper of history to a professor of history. As you know, he came of age during the heyday of the Civil Rights Movement, which was in the vanguard of the crusade against segregation and racism in this country and for integration and equal rights. Julian Bond was an authentic activist, with that word activist in full caps. Throughout his life, he has displayed intellectual and physical courage, both during his college years and throughout his career. He's had a remarkable career as a leader. At Morehouse, he was instrumental in creating a student civil rights organization known as the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. Julian Bond led nonviolent student protests in Atlanta that led to the integration of the movie theaters, lunch counters, and parks. In 1960, at the age of 20, I don't want to put any pressure on any students here, but at the age of 20, he was one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC, instead of becoming the youth division of established civil rights groups, decided to stand on its own. Julian Bond served as the communications director. And in that role, he acquired a prominent national profile. SNCC was referred to as the shock troops of the civil rights revolution. And unique among civil rights groups, SNCC believed in consensus decision-making by members instead of top-down control by leaders. That also sounds familiar. They organized student protests against segregated public facilities like lunch counters, libraries, and swimming pools. And full-time SNCC organizers played a major role in conducting voter rights and voter registration drives throughout the South at a time when that was really dangerous. By 1965, SNCC had fielded the largest staff of any civil rights organization in the South. Julian Bond was also instrumental in founding the Southern Poverty Law Center, a public interest law firm, and he served as its first president from 1971 to 1979. In 1965, at the tender age of about 25, he was one of 8 African Americans elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. And national attention was riveted on his election when the Georgia State Legislature refused to seat him because he had publicly endorsed SNCC's position in opposition to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and because of his sympathy for those who are unwilling to submit to the military draft. The ban on seating him was challenged in the courts, and in 1966, the United States Supreme Court ruled in 9-0 in the case of Bond v. Floyd that the Georgia legislature had denied his freedom of speech and was required to seat him. The next year, Mr. Bond refused to vote when the legislature elected an avowed segregationist, Lester Maddow, as governor of the state of Georgia. During the 1968 election season, Julian Bond led an alternate delegation from Georgia to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and he became the first African American to be proposed as a major party candidate for Vice President of the United States. He graciously and gratefully declined because at the age of 28, he was just shy of the minimum wage age for that office. From 1998 to 2010, he was chairman of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. As chair, he maintained the NAACP's high profile and prominence among national civil rights organizations, while deftly shepherding the organization through leadership and organizational challenges. He frequently took courageous positions, often swimming against the prevailing tide. For example, despite the ambivalence among some in the black community, Julian Bond was an outspoken supporter of same-sex marriage and full rights for gays and lesbians. Nearly a decade ago, he proclaimed that African Americans were the only Americans who were enslaved for 2 centuries, but we are far from the only Americans suffering discrimination then and now. Sexual disposition parallels race. I was born this way. I have no choice, he said. I wouldn't change if I could. Sexuality is unchangeable. Julian Bond has never minced words in leveling pointed criticism at presidents and political groups who he felt did not have the best interests of America and African Americans at heart. Following his activist role in the civil rights movement, he transitioned to academia, where he was a professor of history for many years at the University of Virginia, and he's currently a distinguished professor in residence at American University in Washington, D.C. He's been awarded more than 24 honorary degrees. He's a prolific author of countless articles and a couple of books, and he is even a poet. Blessed with choir boy good looks and a mellifluous voice, Julian Bond is a gifted communicator. He has appeared on every imaginable television and cable channel. For nearly 2 decades, he hosted America's Black Forum, a nationally syndicated public affairs television show. He narrated the epic PBS series Eyes on the Prize, and if anyone here has not seen it, find it and see it. This was on the civil rights movement that he helped to lead. But for me, the accomplishment that seals his reputation as a bona fide Renaissance man is that in 1977, Julian Bond hosted Saturday Night Live. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to a living legend, Julian Bond.
Thank you a great deal, Hugh, for that kind introduction. Some of you may not know that Hugh Price was for many years at the helm of the NAACP sister organization, the National Urban League. National Urban League founded 1 year after the NAACP. We founded in 1909, the Urban League in 1910, and he kept it in a foremost position in the movement for civil rights for all the years of his stewardship, and we have him to thank for that, and let's give him a big round of applause. I'm happy you mentioned my hosting Saturday Night Live. Some of you may not know, it used to be a comedy show. You know, when I get these invitations, I'm often wondering why me? Why have they invited me to come here? And I think probably the reason is because the people here knew of my close and intimate friendship with the major figure of the civil rights movement, the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And if you don't know about it, I'm going to tell you about it right now. I'm one of the 8 people in the world who can honestly claim to have been a student of Dr. King. Dr. King only taught 1 time, only taught 1 class, only 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. And so when you hear someone, and you will, say, I was a student of Dr. King's, if that person wasn't one of the 8, they're telling a tremendous lie. Well, this happened at Morehouse College, where I was a student and Dr. King had been a student, and he taught or co-taught this class with the man who had taught him philosophy, a survey course in philosophy, Socrates, all of the philosophers, and so on. And I'm sorry to say I can't tell you much of what occurred in the class. I didn't have the wit to take extensive notes. I didn't have the wit to bring a tape recorder to class. I didn't record these pearls of wisdom that fell from the lips of this marvelous man. In fact, I remember almost nothing that conspired between the class and Dr. King. But I do remember one day, he and I were walking across the beautiful Morehouse College campus, and I turned to him and I said, Doc, his friends called him Doc. I said, Doc, how are you doing? He said, Julian, I'm not doing well. He said, unemployment is high, racism's everywhere, sexism seems immovable. He said, I feel awful. He said, I have a nightmare. I said, no, Doc, turn that around. Try, I have a dream. I feel doubt. Anyway, let me proceed. About 2 weeks ago, I was in Minneapolis, where I saw a new play called Appomattox. It featured events over 2 important years of American history, 1865, and 1965, demonstrating that things had not changed a great deal in those two years. Specifically, in 1965, African Americans remained unable to be full citizens of the United States. It was, of course, relevant to today. For some Americans still have not decided if our just re-elected president has the birthright of citizenship, or whether people of color ought to be allowed to participate in all the rituals of democracy, including voting. This is an echo of the message that has radiated throughout our history since the Civil War. Black people do not belong in American political society and have no business wielding power over white people. Paradoxically, Barack Obama's victory in 2008 convinced many that all racial barriers and restrictions had been vanquished and we had entered a racial nirvana across the land. This was one of the many unfair burdens placed on Obama's presidency. We knew that his victory did not herald a post-civil rights era America or mean that race had been vanquished. It could not eliminate structural inequity or racist attitude. Indeed, there's evidence that it fomented them. Obama is to the Tea Party as the moon is to werewolves. Now, those who say that race is history have it exactly backward. History is race. The word America, scrambled after all, spells I am race. And America is race, from its symbolism to its substance, from its founding by slaveholders to its rending by the Civil War, from Johnny Reb to Jim Crow, from the Ku Klux Klan to Katrina, from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. This is the second year of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, the war that claimed more American lives than all other wars combined in our nation's history. That it is occurring during the presidency of the first black person to hold the country's highest office is only one of many ironies that abound. When the Civil War ended, Southerners viewed the Republicans as an abolitionist party. Today they embrace it as the white people's party. Then opponents regarded Lincoln's election as intolerable. Today they feel the same way about President Obama's. Having declared war to preserve slavery, in the war's aftermath, the traitor states denied having done so. Like today's right-wingers, they claimed their disaffection was rooted in respect for states' rights. Texas Governor Rick Perry has such respect for states' rights that he suggested his state might secede from the Union. Governor Perry no doubt influenced County Judge Tom Head, the highest elected official in Lubbock, Texas, who said recently about President Obama, he's going to try to hand over our sovereignty of the United States to the UN, okay? What's going to happen when that happens? I'm thinking worst case scenario. Civil unrest, civil disobedience, civil war maybe. And we're not just talking a few riots here and demonstrations. We're talking Lexington, Concord, take up arms, and get rid of the guy. These are the same people who question Obama's citizenship. These birthers, whom we used to know as birchers, have more in common with Confederates than they do with patriots. Both our response to the nation's first black president and the response to the Civil War's anniversary confirm we are still a country at war with itself. But we're not the same country. We've gone from civil war to civil rights. In 1961, when the nation observed the Civil War centennial, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, as was Dr. Martin Luther King. It was only 6 years earlier, during the Montgomery bus boycott, that King had been introduced to the nation and the world. He was then only 26 years old. At that early age, and at that early stage in the boycott, he understood how historic it would be. 4 days after Rosa Parks stood up for justice by sitting down, the boycott began. That evening, at the first mass meeting, Dr. King declared, when the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of people, a black people, who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights, and thereby they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and civilization. In 1963 alone, the year that King, fresh from the battlefields of Birmingham, told the nation of his dream at the March on Washington, there were more than 10,000 anti-racist demonstrations. The result was the enactment of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the most sweeping civil rights legislation before or since, and one of Congress' finest hour. We look back on the years between Montgomery in 1955 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 with some pride. Those were the days when politicians of both parties supported the struggle for civil rights. Now they struggle to be civil. Those were the days when banks loaned money to people, not like today when the people loan money to the banks. Those were the days we were powered by our values and not valued for our power. Those were the days when good music was popular and when popular music was good. Those were the days when the president picked the Supreme Court and not the other way around. Those were the days when we had a war on poverty and not a war on the poor. Those were the days when the news media really was fair and balanced, and not just mouthpieces for the misinformed. But those were not the good old days. In those days, the law, the courts, the schools, almost every institution favored whites. This was white supremacy. When the Supreme Court announced in May of 1955, in the second of two Brown decisions, that the white South could make hay slowly in dismantling segregated schools, I was 1 year older than Emmett Till. His murder 3 months after the second Brown decision was more immediate to me than the court's pronouncements had been. We were nearly the same age when he was killed in Money, Mississippi for whistling at a white woman. His death terrified me. But in the fall of 1957, a group of black teenagers encouraged me to put that fear aside. These young people, the 9 young women and men who integrated Little Rock Central High School, set a high standard of grace and courage under fire as they dared the mobs who surrounded their school. Here I thought, this is what I can be if ever the chance comes my way. The chance to test and prove myself did come my way in 1960 as it came to thousands of other black high school and college students across the South in a mobilization of young black people not duplicated ever before or since. First through the sit-ins, then in freedom rides, then in voter registration and political organizing drives in the rural South, we joined an own movement against white supremacy that had deep, strong roots. Martin King was the most famous, best known of all the modern movement's personalities, but this was a people's movement. It produced leaders of its own. It relied not on the noted but on the nameless, not on the famous but on the faceless. It didn't wait for commands from afar to begin a campaign against injustice. It saw wrong and acted against it. It saw evil and it brought it down. Many of us now stand in reflection of that earlier movement's successes, including the election of Barack Obama. We're confused about what the next steps ought to be. The task ahead is enormous, equal to, if not greater than, the job already done. Looking back on that movement from today, we now see a very different view of the events and personalities of that period. Instead of the towering figures of Kings and Kennedy standing alone, we now see an army of anonymous women and men. Instead of famous orations made to multitudes, we now see the planning and the work that preceded the triumphant speech. And instead of a series of well-publicized marches and protests, we now also see long organizing campaigns and brave and lonely soldiers often working in near solitude. Instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now see aggressive demands and the ethic of self-reliance and self-help. We now realize our view of the movement's goals was narrow too. Seeking more than the removal of racial segregation, that movement did not want to be integrated into a burning house. Rather, it wanted to build a better house for everyone. It marched on Washington for freedom and jobs, not for abstract freedom alone. And instead of a sudden and unanticipated upsurge in black activism in Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unceasing history of aggressive challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago as slavery time. And instead of a movement that ended in 1968 with the death of Dr. King, we now see continued movement stretching from the ancient past until this moment, with differing methods and techniques, whose central goal has always been the elimination of structures based on race. I want to talk about the organization I helped to start and then work with for several years, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, or SNCC. This organization was remembered by President John F. Kennedy. You can hear him on the White House tapes in the middle of the Birmingham movement when he's told that SNCC engaged in some activity in Birmingham the night before. President Kennedy said, and we're so proud of this, he said, "They're sons of bitches, aren't they?" This movement was founded in Raleigh in North Carolina in 1960 by Southern student protesters engaged in sit-in demonstrations against lunch counter segregation. Within a year, the organization evolved from a coordinating committee to a hands-on organization helping local leadership in rural and small-town communities across the South participate in a variety of protest and political and economic organizing campaigns, setting SNCC apart from the civil rights mainstream of the 1960s. Its members, youth, and independents enabled it to remain close to grassroots currents that rapidly escalated the Southern movement from sit-ins to freedom rides to voter rides to political organizing. By 1965, SNCC fielded the largest staff of any civil rights organization operating in the South. It had organized nonviolent direct action against segregated facilities and voter registration projects in Alabama, Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, Louisiana, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and Mississippi. It had built 2 independent political parties. It had organized labor unions and agricultural cooperatives. It gave the movement for women's liberation new energy. It inspired and trained the activists who began the New Left. It helped expand the limits of political debate within Black America, and it broadened the focus of the civil rights movement. Unlike mainstream civil rights groups, which sought integration of blacks into the existing order, SNCC sought structural changes in American society itself. In 1960, and even today, the dominant organization fighting for civil rights was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Then its preferred method was litigation. It had achieved its greatest victory in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education, outlawing segregation in public schools. The NAACP lobbied Congress and President to adopt anti-segregation measures. Its local branches were often the main civil rights outpost in many communities. The NAACP and similar groups and many individuals fought against a tripartite system of racial domination, which whites had solidified over time. The system protected the privileges of white society and generated tremendous human suffering for blacks. In the cities and rural areas of the South, blacks were controlled economically, politically, and personally, relegated to the worst jobs, prevented often by force and terror from free participation in the political process, denied due process of law and personal freedoms all whites routinely enjoyed. Ironically, a consequence of the segregation system was the development in close-knit communities of institutions, churches, schools, and organizations which nurtured and encouraged the fight against white supremacy. The student movement's goals were described to the Democratic Convention's Platform Committee in 1960 by SNCC's first chair, Marion Barry, as seeking a community in which man can realize the full meaning of self, which demands open relationships with others. Barry declared that Southern students wanted an end to racial discrimination in housing, education, employment, and voting. SNCC's goals were similarly broadly described by Executive Secretary James Forman in 1961 as working full-time against the whole value system of the country and by working toward revolution. In 1963, as a program of developing, building, and strengthening indigenous leadership, and by third SNCC Chair John Lewis at the 1963 March on Washington, as building a serious revolution against American politics dominated by politicians who build their careers on immoral compromises and ally themselves with open forms of political, economic, and social exploitation. SNCC pioneered first-time races for blacks in the 1960 Deep South, added foreign policy demands to the black political agenda, and broadened the acceptable limits of political discourse. SNCC was in the vanguard in demonstrating that independent black politics could be successful. Its early attempts to use black candidates to raise issues in races where success was unlikely expanded the political horizon. SNCC's development of independent political parties mirrored the philosophy that political form must follow function, and that non-hierarchical organizations were essential to counter the growth of personality cults and self-reinforcing leadership. For much of its early history, SNCC battled against the fear which had kept Southern rural blacks from aggressively organizing and acting in their own behalf. It strengthened or built aggressive, locally led movements in the communities where it works. While organizing grassroots registration drives, SNCC workers offered themselves as a protective barrier between private and state-sponsored terror and the local communities where SNCC staffers lived and worked. The rural South SNCC entered in 1961 had a long history of civil rights activism. In many issues, however, SNCC staffers were the first paid civil rights workers to base themselves in isolated rural communities, daring, as it reported then, to take the message of freedom into areas where the bigger civil rights organizations feared to tread. SNCC workers were more numerous and less transient than those from other civil rights organizations, and their method of organization was different as well. The NAACP was outlawed in Alabama in 1956 and did not begin operating there again until 1964, although NAACP activists continued under other sponsorship. In 1962, the NAACP had one field secretary each in South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, and a regional staff headquartered in Atlanta. One historian wrote of Dr. King's organization, SCLC has had to adopt a strategy of hit and run, striking one target at a time. SCLC's willingness to run as well as hit provoked consistent criticism from SNCC, which organized the same communities for years rather than months. SNCC mobilized, someone said, SNCC organized. By August, SNCC had projects and permanent staff in a dozen Mississippi communities, in Selma, Alabama, Albany, Georgia, Danville, Virginia, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas. There were 12 workers in the Atlanta headquarters, 60 field secretaries, and 121 full-time volunteers. Typically, SNCC began campaigns by researching the political and economic history of a target community. Field workers were supplied with detailed information on a community's economic and financial power structure, tracing corporate relationships from local bankers and business leadership in a local white citizen council to the largest American banks and corporations. Other research provided the economic and political status of a state's black population. SNCC organizers spent their first weeks in a new community, meeting local leadership, formulating them with an action plan for more aggressive registration efforts, and recruiting new activists through informal conversation, house-to-house canvassing, and regular mass meetings. Registered rural blacks a SNCC worker wrote, would greatly liberate American politics as a whole. At the very least, these new voters would defeat the powerful, hidebound Southern Democrats who are holding the reins of Congress and the Senate on the basis of being elected year after year from districts where black citizens were denied the franchise. SNCC and other organizations fought white terror and helped create a willingness to risk danger by registering to vote. SNCC's broader definition of the civil rights movement's purposes was evident from its beginning. A report from the conference concluded with a warning about America's false preoccupations in 1960. Civil defense and economic power alone will not ensure the continuation of democracy, it said. Democracy itself demands the great intangible strength of the people, able to unite in a common endeavor because they are granted human dignity. Another recommendation noted, students have a natural claim to leadership in this period. They have pioneered in nonviolent direct action. Now we can show we understand the political implications of our movement that goes far beyond lunch counters. We're convinced of the necessity of all local areas joining in the campaign to secure the right to vote. Mississippi, the most resistant state, became a laboratory for SNCC's unique method of organizing. SNCC's work began in southwestern Mississippi in 1961, but when its workers were driven from the area by violence, state suppression, and federal indifference, the organization regrouped in Jackson and the Mississippi Delta counties in early '62. Earlier in 1961, SNCC's Nashville affiliate had continued the freedom rides when Alabama violence threatened to bring them to a halt. After they were released from Parchman Penitentiary, many jail writers had joined the Macomb movement. Several became part of the organizing cadre in the Mississippi movement that followed. Thank you. Unencumbered by allegiances to the National Democratic Party, which frequently constrained other older organizations, SNCC encouraged two black candidates to run for Congress. They ran to shake loose the fear among Mississippi blacks, and through their progressive platforms, gave their intended constituents an expanded notion of what meaning politics might have in their lives. To demonstrate that disenfranchised Mississippi blacks did want to vote, SNCC mounted a Freedom Vote campaign in November of 1963. Over 80,000 blacks cast votes in a mock election for governor and lieutenant governor. 100 northern white students worked in this campaign, attracting attention from Department of Justice and national media as black registration workers had never done, paving the way for the Freedom Summer campaign in 1964. Freedom Summer brought 1,000 mostly white volunteers to Mississippi for the summer of '64. They helped build a new political party SNCC had organized, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They registered voters and staffed 28 freedom schools intended by their designer to provide an education which will make it possible for them to challenge the myths of our society, to perceive more clearly its realities, and to find alternatives and ultimately new directions for action. Over the next several years, SNCC-backed candidates for Congress ran in Albany, Georgia, Selma, Alabama, Danville, Virginia, and Enfield, North Carolina. SNCC helped candidates for Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service boards in Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Mississippi, aided school board candidates in Arkansas in 1965, and worked toward solving the economic problems of the Southern Negro by organizing the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union and the Poor People's Corporation and mounting economic boycotts against discriminatory merchants. Among SNCC's contributions to electoral politics were the formation of two political parties and the conception and implementation of my successful campaigns for the Georgia legislature. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenged the seating of the all-white delegation from Mississippi at the 1964 Democratic Convention, and in 1965 challenged the seating of Mississippi's congressional delegation in Washington. The convention challenge ended in failure when pressure from Lyndon Johnson erased promised support from party liberals. An offer was made and rejected of two convention seats to be filled by the National Party, not by the Freedom Democrats. Freedom Democrat leader Fannie Lou Hamer declared, "We didn't come for no two seats when all of us is tired." Each challenge served as an object lesson for strengthening black political independence, and the organizing and lobbying efforts for each laid the groundwork for congressional passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1965, the Macomb MFDP branch became the first black political organization to express opposition to the war in Vietnam. State MFD officials not only refused to repudiate the Macomb statement, they reprinted it in the state MFDP newsletter, giving it wider circulation and laying the groundwork for future black opponents of the war. The MFDP's legal efforts against white resistance to political equality proved important to black political efforts across the South. The MFDP was not the only organization SNCC helped build, and not the only one that survived the demise of the parent. In 1964, SNCC encouraged a group of progressive New York health professionals to form a group to provide health care to workers in the Freedom Summer campaign. Most were veterans of past attempts to organize physicians to push for integration of the American Medical Association's segregated Southern affiliates and of sporadic attempts to win support for national health insurance. They called their new organization the Medical Committee for Human Rights. The mid-60s were a turning point in the Southern human rights struggle. In the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 accomplished the immediate goals of many in the movement. Northern urban riots in the late 60s made the nation and Southern civil rights workers aware that victories at lunch counters and ballot boxes meant little to blacks locked in northern ghettos. SNCC had long believed its work ought to be expanded to larger cities in the South and outside the region. Executive Committee minutes from December 1963 quote James Forman as asserting, SNCC is going to have to go into poor sections of large cities to work. My campaign for the Georgia House of Representatives in 1965 was an attempt to take the techniques SNCC had learned in the rural South into an urban setting, and to carry forward SNCC's beliefs that grassroots politics could provide answers to problems faced by America's urban blacks. In keeping with SNCC's style, a platform was developed in consultation with the voters. The campaign supported a minimum wage of $2 an hour, repeal of the right to work law, and abolition of the death penalty. When the legislature twice rejected me, objecting to my support of SNCC's anti-war position, the resulting two campaigns gave SNCC a chance to successfully test its critique of American imperialism at the ballot box. In 1966 in Alabama, SNCC helped create a black political party called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, an independent political party which would prove to be a factor in Alabama politics for years to come. The party was formed in reaction to the racism of local and state Democratic parties. Like the MFDP, the new party was open to whites, but no whites in Lowndes County would participate in a black-dominated political effort. Concurrently with the organizing efforts of the MFDP and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, the Bond campaign, SNCC was reassessing its concentration on the South. Projects were established in Washington, D.C. to fight for home rule, in Columbus, Ohio, where a community foundation was organized, in New York City's Harlem, where SNCC workers organized early efforts at community control of public schools, in Los Angeles, where SNCC helped monitor local police and joined an effort at creating a freedom center in a black neighborhood, and in Chicago, where SNCC workers began to build an independent political party and demonstrated against segregated schools. As the focus of the Southern movement had changed, so would the aim of the Northern organizer. Desegregation had proven both elusive and insufficient to the problems of American blacks, North and South. Their ability to control the black community itself and to direct the community's efforts, elected officials, had become paramount in rural Mississippi and in urban New York. Just as its concern for social change had never been limited to Southern states alone, SNCC's concern for human rights had long extended beyond the borders of the United States. It had linked the fight of American blacks with the struggle for African independence from its first public statement. In December 1960, SNCC workers in Atlanta conferred with Kenya labor leader Oginga Odinga, and in September 1964, an 11-member SNCC delegation went to Guinea. SNCC's January 1966 anti-war statement charged the United States with being deceptive in claiming concern for the freedom of colored people in such other countries as the Dominican Republic, the Congo, and the United States itself. There are many reasons for the demise of this important organization. The current of nationalism, ever present in black America, widened at the end of the 1960s to become a rushing torrent which swept away the hopeful notion of black and white together that the decades beginning had promised. SNCC's white staff members were asked to leave the organization and devote their energies to organizing in white communities. Some agreed. The most believed this action repudiated the movement's hopeful call to Americans all side by equal side. Government-sponsored provocateurs also played a role in bringing SNCC down. For many on the staff, both white and black, nearly a decade worth of hard work at irregular subsistence level pay under an atmosphere of constant tension, interrupted by jailings, beatings, and official and private terror, proved too much. When measured by the legislative accomplishments of the 1964 Civil Rights and 1965 Voting Rights Act, SNCC's efforts were successful. But the failure of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to gain recognition in Atlantic City predicted the coming collapse of support from liberals. The murders of 4 schoolgirls in Birmingham and Medgar Evers in Jackson in 1963, of civil rights workers and others in Mississippi in 1964, of Martin Luther King in 1968, argued that nonviolence was no antidote to a violent society. The outbreak of urban violence in the decades end further produced a sense of frustration, alienation in many SNCC veterans. Throughout its brief history, SNCC insisted on group-centered leadership and community-based politics. It made clear the connection between economic power and racial oppression. It refused to define racism as purely Southern, to define racial inequality as caused by rational prejudice alone, or to limit its struggle solely to guaranteeing legal equality. It challenged American imperialism while mainstream civil rights organizations were silent, or curried favor with President Lyndon Johnson, condemning SNCC's linkage of domestic poverty and racism with overseas adventurism. SNCC refused to apply political tests to its membership or its supporters, opposing the red baiting which other organizations and leaders endorsed or condoned. It created an atmosphere of expectation and anticipation among the people with whom it worked, trusting them to make decisions about their own lives. It widened the definition of politics beyond campaigns and elections. For SNCC, politics encompassed not only the electoral races, but also organizing political parties, labor unions, producer cooperatives, and alternative schools. It initially sought to liberalize Southern politics by organizing and enfranchising blacks. One proof of its success was the increase in black elected officials in the Southern states from 72 in 1965 to 388 in 1968. But SNCC also sought to liberalize the ends of political participation by enlarging the issues of political debate to include the economic and foreign policy concerns of America's blacks. SNCC's articulation and advocacy of the black power refined the relationship between black Americans and white power. No longer would political equity be considered a privilege, it had become a right. One SNCC legacy is the destruction of the psychological barriers which kept black Southerners in physical and mental peonage. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee helped to break those chains forever. A more immediate legacy is the people who stood in line to vote in Florida 2 weeks ago. In the face of countless efforts to suppress their votes, they were determined. The last of them voted at 1:30 a.m. after Barack Obama gave his victory speech, but guaranteeing he would carry Florida. Black turnout was up overall on Election Day, spurred by anger at the racist tone of the GOP campaign and their naked attempts to suppress black votes. What began more than half a century ago was the first, and sadly only, modern-day political mobilization of black youth. It was part of a mighty movement that started many years before and that continues to this day. Ordinary women and men proving they could perform extraordinary tasks in pursuit of freedom. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Thank you for coming and giving this wonderful talk. Could you comment briefly on the recent voter ID laws and their relation to voter suppression and how we can fight them? Thank you.
It's going to be difficult to fight them, I think, because Republicans are convinced that black voters particularly regularly cheat. Regularly cheat. I saw somebody, some relatively high-ranking Republican official say that the election had been lost to the Republicans because of voter fraud. And no sane person believes that's true. Of course, it's not the sane people who are saying it. But I think most Americans believe it's not onerous to produce a photo ID when you go to register to vote. Although it is onerous for some people, they don't believe it's onerously generally. And so I think it's going to be difficult to remove those voter ID requirements that are in place now, those that have not been removed by the courts in the rush up to the election. So I think some kind of voter ID law is going to be required almost universally across the United States, despite our best efforts to stop it. But I think the more ridiculous prohibitions against voting fairly will be easily removed, but I think the voter ID is here to stay. And not all at once, please.
Julian, let me ask you a question which has been out there and broad in the land, certainly in black circles. Do you think that President Obama does have, should have, or will never have an explicitly black agenda?
Well, that's a three-part question. I don't think he has explicitly a black agenda, but I think many of the things which he does have a positive effect on black Americans. And I think he does them in part because he realizes that's so. His stimulus plans had a disproportionate effect on black Americans. And the relatively few attempts the administration made at public works and building these shovel-ready projects out had a disproportionate effect on black Americans because they tend to be in areas of the country that are more heavily populated by blacks than whites, and therefore black people are more in need of some kind of help in this regard. So I think he has a black agenda, whether he realizes it or not, or whether he's willing to say it or not. But I don't think he will ever say that he does. I think he thinks it's harmful to his governing. The reason I keep going in my pocket, I wanted you to see why I was so nervous during my speech. I have a ticket here. This is for Tuesday, November 20th, 2012, at 7:30 p.m. It's for Bob Dylan and his band. I won't get back to D.C. tonight until 9:30. But I'm thinking about what am I missing? I love to be here with you. But what am I missing?
Two more questions, 3 more questions. Are you okay with that?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, I'm John Bumpus. I am a master's student at the Woodrow Wilson School. And the question I had is in terms of the current state of black males. And the reason why I'm saying that is because when you look in any part of society in terms of education or incarceration, and even with Trayvon Martin, who was a young male who was gunned down, and people were talking about him like he was an animal. So yeah, if you can please talk about that and how crucial it is and how it's rarely even talked about in the media, and thanks.
Well, I think you've pretty well spelled it out. The rates of incarceration are greater than for the general population. The inability to finish high school is greater than the rest of the population. By many indices, the condition of black males, particularly black young males, is abysmal. And there are plenty of reasons why this is so, and I think all of us are pretty familiar with what they are. The question is, what is to be done about it and who's to do it? There's the kind of problem that in other days and in other times you'd think that there'd be a national concern for it, that there'd be some kind of national effort to do something about it, and perhaps that's something President Obama could turn his second term to. Next time I see him, I'll mention this to him. But it's a national problem, and it needs a national solution. And I don't believe we'll have a national solution until the federal government begins to insist on it. Over here.
So we were talking about the desegregation of schools, but more and more we're talking about that schools are even more segregated now than they were before. So if you could just comment on segregation in schools and your opinions on that.
Well, I saw a statistic a short while ago that segregated schools in the United States are more segregated now than they were in 1969, the year after Dr. King was killed. So more segregated now than in 1969, the year after Dr. King was killed. And this is a much more serious problem, I think, than many people understand, because surely if more people understood it, they'd do something about it. But because they don't understand what the effect of this is. If you make all of the people live here, and none of them can live over here, and that's a problem of housing segregation, which is the root of school segregation. If all the people have to live over here and can't live over here, they don't get to the nicer schools, which may be over here. They don't go to the nicer jobs, which may be over here. All of the good things of life are barred to them, and they're forever condemned to live second-class lives and to have second-class prospects. So unless something's done about the problem of of housing segregation, which is at the root of school segregation, then you're not going to solve these problems. And again, we have laws about housing segregation in the United States, but we unfortunately don't enforce them as vigorously as we ought to, and only until we begin to do so will anything be done about this. So, yeah.
Hi, I just want to thank you again for coming out and speaking to us today. And I was going to go back to sort of what you were talking about earlier about the recent elections. I don't think anybody would kid themselves and say that it wasn't a very polarizing election, particularly in terms of race, and that a lot of that was coming from the Republican establishment. And I was wondering, as you said, the candidacy of Barack Obama probably had a lot to do with bringing that out of the woodwork. But I was wondering if you think that's going to be sort of a permanent feature of American politics for the foreseeable future, or whether you think this very explicitly racial clash in American politics will continue even after Barack Obama is no longer.
You know, about a month before the election, the Associated Press reported on a study, and I can't remember who conducted the study, but it was a reputable study doer. And they said that the level of racial animus in the United States had increased over the 4 years Barack Obama was president. And I believe this to be so. You can't help but think of the numerous times Obama was called names or caricatures of him were drawn, and pictures of him with a neck bone, a bone in his nose, this ugly, ugly treatment he received. You can't help but believe that the level of racial animus has gone up considerably. And I think all of us, by the things we just see and hear, and among our friends, or of course we wonder why they're your friends if they talk like that, among people we know, just demonstrate to us daily that racial animus has just gone up and up and up. I think it'll probably go down again when I think it'll go down again when Obama is no longer president. But because I think in some ways he is, as I said, he's like, you know, catnip to these people. They just go crazy about it. The idea that he's president just is too much. You could see it in Mitt Romney. You could see it in the Romney-Obama relationship, that he thought Obama was not fit to be president, and not fit to be president, not because he wasn't smart enough or well-educated enough, but because he was black. There's something else I wanted to say, but I forgot it. Yes, sir.
Hi. I just wanted to know what were your views on like affirmative action, because the Supreme Court is gonna hear it, and I just want to know your views on if it's been effective or if it should still be enforced.
Well, as you know, the court is going to rule it in a case coming from Texas, and the likelihood, we're told, is that the court will outlaw affirmative action in education. I don't know if that's true, and I hope it's not true. But if it does happen, it'll be a real blow struck at America. I'll tell you something else that's happening, and I don't know if all of us are thinking about this. There's a story in the Washington Post a couple of days ago that said that some schools, and this has a lot to do with young people here, that some schools in America are beginning to stop telling Newsweek magazine what their class ranking is. In fact, some schools are beginning to stop keeping a class ranking. So now you're in high school, and the school will no longer report that 10% of the students go to, or in top of the class, 10% are in the next percentile, and so forth and so on. In Texas, they have an affirmative action plan which is based on class rank. 10% of the children go to first ranking schools in Texas. And if you eliminate keeping rank test or keeping rank list, then this will be thrown out the door. And this has been an effective program in integrating some of Texas' major schools. So this program of affirmative action education is under threat in more ways than we know. But again, I'm interested to see all these questions about education because it's an important subject, but one that will only get better if we first eliminate housing segregation. I think housing segregation is one of the real ills of America that is left unattended. The NAACP, when I was chairman of the board, didn't do enough about it. I don't think Hugh, the Urban League, did much about it. I don't think many civil rights organizations do much about it. It's a serious, serious problem, and it's at the root of many of these problems, and until we begin to address it, they will continue to exist.
Hello, my name is Akil.
Excuse me, before you ask that question, I want to read something I got. This is from Rachel Maddow, whom you know. This is something she said on TV on November 7th. This is November 7th. Ohio really did go to President Obama last night, and he really did win, and he really was born in Hawaii, and he really is legitimately President of the United States, again. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics did not make up a fake unemployment rate last month. And the Congressional Research Service could really find no evidence that cutting taxes on rich people grows the economy. And the polls were not skewed to oversampled Democrats. And Nate Silver was not making up fake projections about the election in May. conservatives feel bad. Nate Silver was doing math. And climate change is real. And rape does really cause pregnancy sometimes. And Benghazi was an attack on us. It was not a scandal by us. And nobody's taking away anyone's guns. And taxes have not gone up. And the deficit is dropping, actually. And Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction. And the moon landing was real. And FEMA is not building concentration camps. And UN election observers are not taking over Texas. And moderate reforms on the regulation of the insurance industry and the financial services industry in this country are not the same thing as communism. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Akil Ward Daniels, class of 06 from Morehouse.
I can tell you were a Morehouse band because you can always tell a Morehouse band,
But you can't tell me much.
but you can't tell them much.
I'm from Mississippi, and you know, there's a lot of problems, of course, what the gentleman was talking about, you know, young black men and violence, and a lot of things like, you know, a lot of other struggles these days. And there's also issues with like race and all kinds of polarizing things like, you know, poverty and stuff like that. You know, and I've seen things like, you know, Katrina and like the oil spill. I'm from the Gulfport, Biloxi area, and my other half the family is in New Orleans. So, you know, one thing that did come out of that was, I guess you can say, a good thing that I've seen is more people like kind of coming together. In a sense, it's kind of got me in the thought process more like, you know, some kind of common occurrence or thought or project basically can help people like, you know, bridge their differences, because, you know, you can't really be angry at somebody who's like, you know, poor and they want to sit there and show their dominance or show that they're, you know, a man or something like that. You know, you can't really be mad at them, but it doesn't make it right if they're sitting there oppressing someone else because of it. And I was just wondering if you could, you know, if you have any thoughts about like maybe a project or like things or events that, you know, could be done basically to unify people. Because I mean, those events did unify to a degree, but, you know, I'd rather have that not happen to unify.
I think there are groups and organizations in this country that do what you're talking about. There's one of them I know of, and the name has slipped me, something like Common Cause, that's not it, but like Common Cause, that tries to get people to talk about these things and to get together, even people who feel differently about them or who think differently about them. Ideally, if we had more of this, then again, the better off we'd be. Where are you from in Mississippi?
Gulfport, Biloxi.
I lead a civil rights trip every year for the University of Virginia, and we're going to Philadelphia this year. We're going to start in Birmingham to Montgomery to Selma to Philadelphia to Jackson to New Orleans. And as we go along, we're going to meet people who made the civil rights movement and who visit places where the civil rights movement were made. And I've run across a historian who is, and this is something you mentioned, Eyes on the Prize. There's a guy who in college saw Eyes on the Prize for the first time. And for the first time saw the story about Emmett Till. And from that day to this, 17 years, has been just infatuated with Emmett Till and wanted to tell the story about Emmett Till. And he's going to take us to the place where Emmett Till allegedly whistled at this woman, the place where Emmett Till was taken from his bed and taken out by these two men, the place where Emmett Till was beaten almost to death, the place where Emmett Till was thrown in the water tied to the cotton gin fan, the place where he was taken out of the water, the place where his killers were tried and acquitted. And we'll meet as we go along the way people who made the movement. And how many here know the name Robert Gratz? You must be a Lutheran.
Pardon?
You must be a Lutheran.
No, I was on your trip last year.
That's not fair. But for those of you who don't know who Robert Gratz is, Robert Gratz was the white pastor of the Black Lutheran Church in Montgomery. And you know there are not many Black Lutherans. But on the weekend when Rosa Parks is arrested, Robert Gratz is out of town. And he comes back to town finding out that Black Montgomery is in uproar. Something's happened. A woman's been arrested. There's going to be a boycott. He calls people in his congregation, and they either can't or won't tell him anything. And finally, he calls this woman who uses his church as a meeting place for the NAACP, and he says, somebody's been arrested. There's going to be a boycott. Who is it? She says, it was me, Pastor Gratz. I was the one arrested. And Pastor Gratz lives in Montgomery now. He's 85 years old. His wife is now finishing her education at what used to be Alabama School for Negroes. Alabama State College for Negroes. Education she had interrupted to have their children, and they both live in Montgomery, and even though they're in their 80s, they're both fit and able, and they're going to regale us with stories of the Montgomery bus boycott. Along the way on this trip, it's a wonderful trip, isn't it?
It's wonderful.
Yeah. You just meet people and see people who made the movement, and you realize that this really is a second American Revolution, and we Americans don't know as much about it as we ought to know. Yes, sir. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hello. You've talked about how segregation, like how the school system is more segregated than it has been like 4 years ago, but also income inequality, something that Dr. King was very passionate about in the later years of his life, has increased since the 70s. And not only that, but political inequality has increased more, with a small amount of people having more say in what goes on in our politics. And I want to know how you feel about the rise in income and political inequality.
I'm against it. And I want somebody to do something about it.
Like, do you have like any suggestion of how those things can be like dealt with, like more specifically income inequality?
Well, we're beginning, the Congress is likely to do something about it, I think, by getting rid of the Bush tax cuts and by asking the people who have the most to contribute a little more than they do to American society. That's a beginning, and we hope we'll move on from there.
Thank you for speaking. It's an honor to be here. You spoke earlier about moral courage, and I'm wondering where you see Americans' moral courage today and how we can nurture it.
Well, I tried to end on one note of moral courage. I think the people who stood in line until 1:30 in the morning in Florida, I mean, that's a certain kind of courage and strength that I don't think all of us have. I vote in D.C. It was easy for me. The polling place was full, but not overcrowded. And so I was in and out pretty quickly. It was an easy thing for me to do. I think there are many, many instances of moral courage that we see all around us. And I think sometimes we don't recognize them when we see them. We don't understand that these people are doing something remarkable. I think when I saw the pictures on TV of those people in Florida and in other parts of the country standing in line, just waiting and waiting and waiting on a hot, hot day to do this ordinary act of citizenship, these are people showing a degree of moral courage. No matter, we really don't know who some of them are going to vote for. They could have voted for someone I didn't want them to vote for, but we don't know. But whether they were doing that or not, they were demonstrating some act of courage to take not enough time out of their days to be under these circumstances, sweating and just overcome by this heat. That's one example. I think there are others. I'm not able to sum them up right now, but there are others. And when we see them, we ought to recognize them and applaud them. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a question about black people in the higher educational system. I know there's a lot of talk about reform at the secondary level of middle schools and high schools, but I also think there's a large problem in the university system as well. Black people typically drop out at much higher rates than people of other races, and also with affirmative action, a lot of, especially at places like Princeton and more elite institutions, the people that end up benefiting from affirmative action tend to be first generation African Americans who are the children of African immigrants, and not really the people, the descendants of people who have been struggling in this country for years and years. So I'm wondering kind of what we can do to kind of get the discourse going about the problems in these elite universities.
Well, I think you have to talk about it. You have to talk about it where you are in a university. You have to talk about it and challenge other people about what their beliefs are. And if you don't think their beliefs are the correct beliefs, you have to challenge them. And the lights have gone out. And then you have to, and now they come back on. And you have to challenge other people. And if their beliefs don't meld with yours, you have to find some way to politely convince them that they're wrong and you're right. I mean, we have to have the word dialogue is just so overused in this country, but we really don't have enough of a dialogue, and it'd be great if we had more of a dialogue about this subject. Nobody there, and you, miss.
Thank you so much for being with us here today. We appreciate you missing your concert. So my question is about the Black Panther Party. I just finished reading The Savage City by T.J. English, and he talks a lot about the Black Panther Party in the 1970s in New York City. And I was wondering what your opinion is on their contribution to the civil rights movement.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The Black Panther
Yes,
Party?
Black Panther Party. Oh. The Black Panther Party made a sizable contribution. You know, it's hard to measure it. They made X amount of contribution or Y amount of contribution, but made a big contribution. They demonstrated a kind of bravery in young black men that had been absent or seemed to be absent beforehand. They demonstrated that you can organize in urban settings in ways that had not been done before. So they made many, many contributions. And I think if we knew more about them, we'd know more. I showed a section of Eyes on the Prize that focuses on the Black Panther Party last night in my classroom. And they were amazed. This is about something they knew. These are honor students at a major American university who knew nothing at all about this phenomenon of the party. And had they known more about it, I think they'd be better citizens. And now I think I've made them better citizens. And you're sadly the last one. So it better be good.
So I'm taking a urban politics class, and we learned during the civil rights movements that rich white citizens left the cities and left black people in the cities, and we've seen that through Trenton, Camden, and Newark. What could we do to change that as leaders to fix problems that are occurring in those cities?
How can we make them stop leaving the city?
To improve it.
Well, I live in a city where white people are flooding back in, much to the consternation of many of the black people. I live in a section of Washington I call Upper Caucasia. But I should not joke about this subject. Are you asking about what do we do to keep the egress of white people from cities?
No. You know, I'm not really, I guess, how can you have cities thriving again? How can you have economic, improve the schools, improve the citizens, and help them get cities back on their feet?
Again, this is all these questions about how can you do this, how can you do that, these are questions that are based on the ability of citizens to take action. If the citizens are not able to take action, not willing to take action, not willing to mobilize themselves, not willing to get together in small and larger groups to do something about the multitude of problems we see about us, if the citizens are not able to do that, it will not be done. So we, and by we I mean you, have to begin with yourself, somebody you know, somebody else that he knows, somebody she knows, so on, and build up a cadre of people willing to talk about these things and then to act about these things. Unless we're willing to do that, both individually, but most important, collectively, unless we're able to do that, it's not going to be done. And if it's not done, it'll be a hell of a time for the United States. Thank you all very much.